Louis Creed, a doctor from Chicago, is appointed director of the medical service at the University of Maine. He moves into a large house near the small town of Ludlow with his wife Rachel and their 2 young children, Ellie and Gage, aged 6 and 2 respectively, along with Winston Churchill, Ellie's cat. From the moment they arrive, the family faces many problems. Ellie injures her knee after falling from a swing, and Gage gets stung by a bee and is almost run over by a truck. Fortunately, the neighbor, the 83-year-old Jud Crandall, helps them by warning Louis and Rachel about the highway that runs alongside their house, which is constantly traversed by large trucks. Jud and Louis become friends. Since Louis's father died when he was 3 years old, he sees Jud as a father figure. A few weeks after the Creeds arrive, Jud jeopardizes their friendship when he takes the family for a walk behind their house. A path leads to an animal cemetery, the pet cemetery of the title, where the town's children bury dead animals. This provokes a heated argument between Louis and Rachel many days later. Rachel doesn't want to talk about death and is worried that Ellie might be shaken by what she saw at the cemetery. It is explained later that Rachel was traumatized by the premature loss of her sister, Zelda, who suffered from cerebrospinal meningitis. Louis himself undergoes a traumatic experience in the first weeks of teaching when Victor Pacow, a student who died in a car accident, says his last words to Louis, even though the two do not know each other. The night following Pasco's death, Louis has a very realistic dream in which he meets Pacow in spirit form, who claims to want to help him out of gratitude for having tried to do everything to save him. He then accompanies him to the cemetery, pointing out a spot where there are tangles of plants and piled up trunks. Victor states that this is a boundary not to be crossed and warns Louis not to go beyond, no matter how necessary you think it is, then admonishes him about the possible tragic consequences that could befall his family if he instead chooses to do the opposite. Louis wakes up the next morning convinced that it was, in fact, a dream until he sees his feet covered in dirt and pine needles. Despite this, he labels the dream as an episode of sleepwalking caused by the stress endured during Pasco's death, coupled with the anxiety provoked by his wife's affair. Louis is forced to confront death again when, on Halloween, Jud's wife, Norma, suffers a heart attack. Thanks to Louis's quick thinking, Norma recovers quickly. Jud is grateful for the help received and decides to repay it when Church dies on Thanksgiving Day. Rachel and the children are visiting the grandparents in Chicago, and Louis is afraid to give Ellie the bad news. Having pity for Louis, Jud takes him to the pet cemetery to bury Church. Instead of stopping here, Jud continues on a terrifying journey to the real cemetery, an ancient place used by the Micmac Indians. Here, Louis, perplexed, buries the cat, then returns home with the old man. Louis thinks this story is over until the following afternoon, when the cat comes back home. It is obvious that Church is not the same as before. Church hunts mice and birds more often than before, but he dismembers them without eating them. The cat also emits a smell that makes Ellie not wanted in her room at night. Jud confirms that this is the rule, not the exception, for resurrected animals. The elder reveals to Louis that he learned about that place when he was young, more precisely on the day his dog Spot died from injuries sustained after chasing a rabbit through barbed wire. Jud, devastated by grief at the time, met Stanny B., considered a madman by the vast majority of the townspeople, who took him to the Micmac cemetery, where he buried his dog, who, like Church, returned and lived for several more years with Jud and his family, before dying a second time and being, this time, buried in the animal cemetery. Immediately after, Louis bluntly asks Jud if anyone has ever buried a person in that place, but the elder vehemently replies no, appearing particularly annoyed by the question. Louis is very frightened by Church's resurrection and begins to wish he had never done it. At the beginning of the following year, Norma suddenly dies from a stroke, but Rachel does not attend the funeral, claiming to be severely ill. The husband, sensing that it is just an excuse, asks his wife for an explanation as to why she is so sensitive about death, so she reveals to him that, when she was little, her older sister Zelda fell ill with cerebrospinal meningitis and that her parents hid her from everyone, isolating her in a remote room of the house as she was considered a source of great embarrassment for a wealthy family like theirs. Rachel states that her sister's condition was a burden for her. She couldn't stand having to take care of her and even came to hate her. One day, Zelda suddenly died before Rachel's eyes, who had been entrusted with taking care of her by their parents, who had gone to celebrate Passover with some friends. Rachel concludes the story by stating that when she realized Zelda was dead, she ran into the street laughing hysterically, feeling finally liberated from a burden, but this later caused her a deep sense of guilt, generating a strong repulsion towards death and instilling in her the absurd doubt that her sister, in reality, had never died and could return at any moment to take revenge. Louis, hearing this story, finally realizes the reason that had driven him for so many years to want to avoid the topic of death with Ellie, stating that he would never criticize her on the matter again. A few months later, it is little Gage who dies, run over by a truck after venturing onto the highway during a moment of distraction by the parents. At the child's funeral, Louis also has a violent altercation with Erwin Goldman, Rachel's father, who has always disapproved of the relationship between the man and his daughter. Louis is particularly tormented for not having been able to save his son and begins to consider the idea of bringing his son back to life with the help of the Indian Sematary. Jud, imagining what Louis has in mind, tries to dissuade him by confessing that he lied when he told Louis that no one had ever buried a person in the Micmac cemetery. Jud tells him about Timmy Baderman, a local boy who died in the war. His father, Bill Baderman, buried him in the cemetery to bring him back to life, but when Timmy resurrected, he was no longer himself. Several people in Ludlow, in the following days, claimed to have seen him wandering the streets, with a disheveled appearance and an apparently vacant stare. Jud and a group of friends, aware of the cemetery's power, feared that too many people might see Timmy and that such a thing would inevitably reach the army authorities, who would then launch an investigation and send someone to exhume Timmy's body to ensure that it was indeed his. This was very risky, as it could reveal the power of that place to the whole world, so the group went to Bill in an attempt to make him understand. Upon arriving at the location, they found the man and his son Timmy, who confronted them one by one, revealing uncomfortable details about their private lives, details that the boy could never have known. The group, horrified and aware that they were facing a demonic being, decided to leave, but not before making it clear to Bill that if he didn't kill and bury his son again, they would take care of it themselves. That very evening, Bill killed Timmy, set his house on fire, and he takes his own life. Jud ends the story by stating that he feels responsible for what happened, saying that the place has a power and this power caused Gage's death because Jud, driven by it, brought Louis there. Despite this, Louis decides to put the plan into action, convinced that there is a possibility that Gage could return from the world of the dead as the loving child he once was. Despite this, however, he does not rule out the possibility that Gage could return malevolent like Timmy did, so he decides to convince Rachel that she and Ellie should go stay with the grandparents in Chicago for a few days, promising to join them as soon as he finds a replacement at work. By doing so, Louis will be able to test his theory, and if it proves to be wrong, he himself will send the son back to the grave, without ever revealing it to his wife and daughter who, in his opinion, should never bear such a burden. Rachel, despite having suspicions about her husband's insistence, eventually gives in and goes to Chicago with Ellie. During the journey, however, Ellie has a nightmare in which Victor Pockow appears to her, revealing that her father is about to do something terrible and that they were together when her soul had disincarnated from her body. Rachel, realizing that neither she nor Louis have ever revealed to her the circumstances of Victor's death, becomes convinced that Ellie's dream is a premonitory one and that Louis wants to harm himself. She decides to promptly return to Ludlow, finding herself forced to rent a car due to the lack of flights. Before leaving, the woman calls Jud so that the neighbor can check on her husband, but when he also responds vaguely, Rachel suspects that both he and Louis are hiding something from her, so she demands that the old man reveal everything. Put on the spot, Jud reassures her that Louis has no intention of killing himself and promises that he will talk, but sensing that Louis wants to bring Gage back, he convinces her to go to him first before going home when she arrives, without revealing her husband's plan. Meanwhile, Louis works to exhume his son's body and take it to the cemetery, managing to evade Jud's watchfulness, who falls asleep just as the man returns home, an event likely caused by the cemetery's power. During the journey to the cemetery, Louis has a close encounter with the spirit of the Wendigo that haunts those lands and which, according to beliefs, possesses the resurrected, but he emerges unscathed. As planned, he buries his son in the soil of the Micmac, returns home, and falls asleep. At night, Gage returns from the world of the dead in the form of a demonic monster, a shadow of himself, enters the parents' room, and steals a scalpel, then heads to Jud's house. Here, Gage terrifies Jud, transforming his face into that of his deceased wife, shouting at him for having betrayed him with all his best friends, and then, with the help of Church, knocks him to the ground and kills him by stabbing him with the scalpel. A few hours later, Rachel arrives, and after entering Jud's house, she is lured upstairs, where her little son is waiting for her. The woman, in tears and incredulous to see her son alive again, is also brutally killed. Morning arrives. Louis, getting up, notices an unfamiliar car outside Jud's house, but doesn't think much of it. He then remains pleased to see the small footprints of his son around the house, sensing that he has returned, but after a few minutes, he receives a phone call from Rachel's father, who asks him if the woman has arrived home, informing him that she left after Ellie had a nightmare about him and the death of her mother, and that she undertook the journey with a rental car. Louis, terrified, realizes that he has committed an atrocity and that his wife might have been caught in the crossfire, despite his intentions not to involve her. Desperate, he initially even contemplates suicide, but, regaining his clarity, decides to put an end to everything. First, he kills Church with a lethal injection, then he goes to Jud's house, where he wraps his friend's body in a sheet. Going upstairs, he finds Rachel's lifeless body, partially devoured by the son, who lunges at him to kill him, but the man manages to overpower him and sends him back to the grave with a lethal injection. In any case, we learn that Louis has not yet learned from his mistakes. Possessed by the evil spirit that allows the resurrection of corpses, he thinks that if Gage has become a kind of demon, it is due to the too much time that has passed from the moment of death to the burial in the Indian cemetery. Therefore, he sets Jud's house on fire and takes his dead wife to the burial site. The ghost of Pockow tries one last time to dissuade Louis, then disappears forever while he continues heedlessly with the task. That same night, the resurrected Rachel returns to Louis, who kisses her passionately. Overwhelmed with happiness, the man doesn't notice that his wife, while responding to the kiss, is about to kill him with a large kitchen knife.